Now I would like to invite the representative of the Russian Federation. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The report we're discussing today, the report by the High Representative on Bosnia and Herzegovina, unfortunately is far from an impartial assessment of the situation in the country, contrary to what its author, Valentin Isco, is trying to present it as. What we see is the desire to use any means possible to justify the continued international protectorate over Bosnia and Herzegovina, to show that there's still a need for the office of the High Representative, even at this stage of Bosnian settlement. This is a questionable premise, but this is what the entire structure of the report is showing, which of course negatively impacts its contents. First of all, Mr. Insko continues settling personal scores with the leaders of Bosnian Serbs and Croats by blaming them for all of the difficulties without any justification, all of the difficulties in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Our close dialogue with the leaders, including the meeting of President Putin with the chair of the presidency, Dodik, in Belgrade on the 17th of January this year, shows exactly the opposite. It shows that all of the responsible Serb and Croat politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina are committed to the peace agreement of 1995. But at the same time, what they intend to do is to make sure that its provisions having to do with the inviolability of the decentralized architecture of Bosnia and Herzegovina and equality of three constituent peoples are strictly abided by. The equality guaranteed by the Dayton Agreement has recently been increasingly questioned by some people from Sarajevo, and that is the reason, the underlying reason for most of the problems in Bosnia. But Mr. Insko refuses to acknowledge that. He only mentions in passing and without criticism only some examples of such undermining of equality. And this includes the idea by the Bosniaks to question the Republika Srpska appellation in the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is Dayton terminology. The examples also include their lack of desire to meet the Bosnian Croatians halfway on the issue of including into the law on elections or provisions which would ensure that only legitimate representatives of the three constituent people of Bosnia and Herzegovina can be affirmed at the highest in the highest offices. It's become a commonplace to see Mr. Insko's affection for the issue of European and transatlantic integration of Bosnia and Herzegovina at the expense of his direct responsibilities on the implementation of 5+2 plan. As a consequence of that, there is very little movement in this area recently, and the resources spent on the Office of High Representative are basically spent in vain. We expect that Mr. Insko will finally start paying due attention to the program of wrapping up of the Office of the High Representative, both in his reports and, most importantly, in his practical work. Let me address separately the issue of the relationship between Bosnia and Herzegovina and NATO. I'd like to underscore that even the High Representative has to acknowledge and document the fact that there are substantive divergences on the issue of further rapprochement with the alliance amongst the Bosnian sides. Banja Luka is against this because they cannot accept the borderline between Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia, turning that into a new dividing line. They can't accept that. And one cannot ignore this fact, and any attempts to bring Sarajevo closer to NATO against the Dayton principles of consensus for political decision can undermine the entire work on the reform track and can also lead to other destructive consequences. We can but notice that Mr. Insko's report contains a whole series of negative comments having to do with measures aimed at providing more assistance and staff to the entity law enforcement. This is something that we're puzzled by because the High Representative, if anyone, should know that everything that he describes is fully in line with the existing law. Furthermore, this is a reaction to a large scale of growth of migration risks recently and the terrorist threats that accompany them. Unfortunately, these issues are not adequately reflected in the High Representative's report. What is also biased is the creation in the Republika Srpska of international commissions on investigating the crimes in 1991, 1995 against all peoples in Srebrenica and against Serbs in Sarajevo. And here the High Representative goes all hell for leather, stating immediately that there is a minimal possibility for these commissions' contribution to justice and international reconciliation. We think this is an unacceptable approach. We would like to underscore that such commissions is something that resulted from obvious gaps in ICTY and the residual mechanism. And this is something that we have expressed concern over on many occasions. We do hope that the experts from 12 countries within the commissions will be able to recreate the comprehensive picture of crimes, international and religious crimes in Srebrenica and Sarajevo. And this is because many of these crimes turned out to be outside of the scope of ICTY. And we also suggest that we wait with conclusions until the commissions issue their findings. We would like to also draw your attention to a number of important, we think, procedural aspects. First of all, we call on the High Representative to accurately reflect in his reports the work carried out by the steering board of the Peace Implementation Council in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to make sure that quotes from communiques and statements are also accompanied by information about the countries which did not support them, if there are such countries. We will state that the Russian delegation did not approve the steering board document of 5th December 2018 for a whole number of serious reasons. We're convinced that including into the text the unjustified negative assessment of the general elections in Bosnia on the 7th of October, one-sided interpretation of war crimes, and there was as a mentoring attitude towards the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina can only undermine the authority of the steering board. And we expect that this international mechanism will continue being aimed at consensus, at broad approaches to Bosnian settlement, and that way the High Representative will not have to cover up the real state of affairs. Mr. President, once again, we have to note with regret the members of the Security Council have only had a few days to study the High Representative's report prior to its discussion here in the Council. We would like to be able to have more time to acquaint ourselves with it. We note that all of the colleagues who are interested in a deeper understanding of what's happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina can read the informative and full content-rich report by the government of Republika Srpska, which covers the period from November 2018 to April of this year and covers many of the gaps in the High Representative's report. The Russian stance as regards the stabilization process in Bosnia and Herzegovina will also continue be based on strictly adhering to the peace agreement by all parties, actively helping with inter-Bosnia political dialogue, socio-economic development of the country and its entities, and supporting its cultural diversity. We are convinced that the time for the external protectorate over Bosnia and Herzegovina is something that belongs firmly in the past, and the office of the High Representative, with its extraordinary bond powers, has become a burden for further democratic progress for this country. We think that what is needed is to continue cutting the budget and the staffing of the Office of the High Representative fully in line with the something that was confirmed by the steering board more than 10 years ago, namely the notion of local ownership. Our view is that the key issue for Bosnia and Herzegovina remains formation of the new Council of Ministers at the central level, the level of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and 4 out of its 10 cantons, which should be based on a firm parliamentary majority and be aimed at continuing with pushing the reforms forward. And this includes improving the work of the general justice bodies, including the removing foreign specialists from the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, enhancing the effectiveness, professionalism, and impartiality of the courts and the prosecution office of the country. It's very important to make sure that the content of all such reforms is something the Bosnians agree upon themselves. This is the only way to ensure sure that these solutions are viable and will be yet another step for Bosnia and Herzegovina in Dayton implementation. Let me repeat and say that it is justifiable and counterproductive to continue exerting pressure on Republika Srpska and Bosnian Serb leaders, and this is something that has been done inter alia through illegitimate one-sided restrictions. These kind of actions and negative rhetoric is something that worsens the political atmosphere in the country. It gives rise to greater tension and hampers in international trust. We would like to be able to hope that the harmful nature of restrictions at current level is something that all participants will recognize. In conclusion, I would like to underscore that Russia aims at developing a mutually beneficial dialogue with Bosnia and Herzegovina on the basis of respecting the sovereignty and the territorial unity of the country, and also the wide authorities for the two entities and the equality of the three constituent peoples of the country. We very much wish the Bosnian parties every success in building a coalition and in resolving all outstanding issues. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation